Rahma with Rose. Today we are joined by Medina Tenour Whiteman. She's a British American Muslim writer, poet, and singer based near Granada, Spain. She is the author of the poetry collection Love is a Traveler and We Are Its Path, Huma's Travel Guide to Islamic Spain, and The Invisible Muslim Journeys Through Whiteness and Islam. Her work Radio, Critical Muslim, Sacred Footsteps, Amalia, and other international platforms, as well as being anthologized in A Kaleidoscope of Stories by Lote Tree Press and The Ordinary Chaos of Being Human, coming out this year. She is co-founder of the Muslim Writers Salon, which I'm part of, and how I got to get to know her. It's an amazing program, and regularly holds creative writing workshops online and in person. Welcome, Medina. It's so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. So we had a conversation about this before, and I'm really excited to hear a lot about your own story, which you've written about, and that you can share here on the podcast, as well as your interests and your various research projects these days. But let's start with the question I always like to start with. Hello, little person. Um,
I'm doing a podcast. I did tell you, okay?
It's okay. We can edit that out. Can you remember when you first started getting interested in spirituality?
Well, that's a really, really interesting question. I think as a child, I used to have moments where I would sort of, I don't know if you would call it dissociation. I mean, I certainly did used to dissociate a lot, but I would sometimes just have these, I think especially I remember being like a teenager, having moments when I just kind of like almost separate from everything that was around me, but going inward and just feel this very deep sense of peace, actually. And, everything is okay and I'm okay. And it's all going to be fine, regardless of what was happening around me. And even like it felt like a hot energy inside me, like a hot kind of, I don't want to say hot air because I am pretty much full of hot air, but um I guess there were also moments where I felt like I could, especially in times later on when I was going through something very difficult, very stressful experiences, where if I got the chance to just be by myself for a little while,
Mm-hmm.
I could sort of lie down and imagine, I just would imagine myself and feel like I was, lying in a river and that the water was kind of just flowing over me and that sort of through me. And it felt so peaceful and so calming. And it wasn't an ordinary state of mind. It wasn't an ordinary state of consciousness. So I think those were moments when I really felt um, the conventional mode that human beings tend to live in was it wasn't everything that existed. It wasn't the be all and end all. And in fact, it wasn't a very healthy place to be in long term. Like you can be in it for a while. You can gird your loins and go out there and do your work and do your stuff. And it sort of feels good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like there's an arc and it reaches its peak and then you start feeling tired again. It's like caffeine. You have your coffee, you get up and you get really chatty and, well, I get very chatty, but, very active. And then it sort of starts tailing off and you start kind of going, okay, now I have to do the opposite. And I have to go in. You have your out breath, you have your in breath. And so I spent quite a lot of time as a kid on my own, actually. I mean, I've always been quite a social person, I think. I'm very ambivert. I love being with people and I, kind of charge up when I'm with people. But then by the same token, I'll get to a point where I kind of max out and I reach the saturation point. And I really just need to go in. And that's the time when I want to write. I want to pick up my guitar and sing. I just like to daydream. I honestly just love having time every day, or at least several times during the week, just allow myself completely to daydream and pottering around. And in that time, I feel like at some depth of my consciousness, I'm kind of piecing things together and, tying little knots and, cleaning out corners. And it's sort of not directional. It's not like I'm going in and going, right, I'm going to go sort out my subconscious. It's being done on a very intuitive level. And that, the hours can fly by. Or by contrast, a lot can happen in a very short period of time. It's when you sort of again, you're kind of stepping out of that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say ordinary. I don't think it needs to be ordinary, but I think in our, you know, highly productivity oriented capitalist kind of societies, that's been taken to be the ordinary mode. I forgot where my sentence began. Essentially that there has to be like a mirror experience as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think in a way that's it's on the one hand it's where my creativity comes from, and on the other hand it's also a sort of a healing process and a self-soothing. Partly it's self-soothing, and it's also a way of understanding things, because I think you can have all the information in the world, and I think this is where we are at as humans right now. We're in totally in the information era. You can rabbit hole about any specific topic you want and spend weeks just on Wikipedia alone, as I have done, I have to admit. But unless you have the ability to take a step back and sort of see it a little bit from the bigger picture, and see how things fit together and derive some kind of meaning from it that is useful to you in your life, it's like a lot of clutter. It can be a lot of clutter, and it can be very overwhelming as well. And I think that's part of it. I've sort of struggled with overwhelm. So
Could we return to thank you for sharing this. Could we return to when you were talking about as a child you experienced this almost disassociation, but really this like feeling of being this otherworldly kind of experience? Like I'm very curious about that. If you're willing to go into this further, like how old were you and how did you understand or explain this experience?
I in a way I don't really have like specific memories as a child, although
Yeah.
I, you know, spending a lot of sort of unstructured time in unstructured play, pottering around the garden, digging,
Yeah.
coming up.
Before the era of screens.
Right, exactly. And my parents actually, to their credit, although we didn't like it at the time, were very restrictive on like what we were, you know, what we could watch on TV. Like in England, there was only a few channels. There was BBC One, BBC Two, and then as we got older, BBC Three. And sorry, not BBC. There was ITV, Channel Three, and then Channel Four, and Channel Five came later. They only told us that BBC existed. We didn't know that any other channels existed. And of course, there was nothing that was like on demand. So we had a lot of books in the house. I was quite a floaty person, and I would just sort of spend a lot of time just, I guess, pondering things. And I think listening to a different kind of an inner voice as well. I think that's what it comes down to. There's the mental chatter, and there's the anxiety chatter, and there's, you know, trying to figure things out. And these are all different kind of bandwidths of the mind. And then there's another one, which is when you, I think, take a step back. It physically feels like, and I think it felt like then, like leaning back, like an almost leaning back on my heels, not leaning forward to try and scrabble into the world to get something out of it, but leaning back, and it's like almost like a receptive position to take. And of course, growing up as a Muslim and being a part of dhikr gatherings, and, you know, singing was always something that I found very centering and would bring me back into that place quite quickly. And especially if you're looking at that, I think there's lots of different dimensions to that. One is the words that you're saying. If you look at the words, even if you're singing in a language you don't understand, the sounds you're making have an impact on your body. And sound is a vibration, of course. And then the meanings of what you're saying are important, because if you are repeating over and over and over again, it's like an affirmation, it's like a mantra. It does kind of become embedded in you. And you start to believe it as well, even if you're saying Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakeel without completely trusting that Allah is your sufficiency. If you say it over and over and over and over and over again, it does start to ring truer for you. And I think, you know, I am very glad that I was given the opportunity to grow up in that kind of medium and that environment. At the same time, I wasn't surrounded by that all the time. We were living in little villages, like in the middle of nowhere, not surrounded by this lovely idyllic Muslim community. So, you know, there was also a definite sense of being separate, a sense of alienation, a sense of, I don't really belong here. I'm not really integrated into this world. I know how to behave in the way that they expect of me. And I learned that from a very young age. I know how to be what they want from me. And so I'm masked. I think I'm only now really unpacking how much masking I did. And then, you know, you take the mask off, you come home, and then I like run around and like make silly noises. And I still do that. Like there's still this part of me that I really struggle to sort of present to the whole world. But to go back to childhood, yeah, I think as a young child, I can't really put my finger on any specific memory, but I do remember being as a young teenager. I was maybe about 13. And again, at that time, especially, I spent a lot of time by myself. Like I did theater. I did a lot of, putting myself out there. I performed music and stuff. But then I would come home, I would just be like, I just want to be by myself. I just really need to have the silence and have the space to bring all these things out that I've absorbed and kind of be able to understand them a little bit better. And there was one particular experience I remember when I was lying on my bed and I was just thinking about things and thinking about how, we look at our lives, our everyday lives as if everything is so important. And these little things, these conversations that we've had, or this conflict we've had that's personal, that as if they're so important. And then at the same time, this is just a house. This is just a town. This is just a country. This is just a planet. And like I literally realized I was floating up by the ceiling. And I was like, oh, I've just left my body. That kind of freaked me out. And I kind of snapped back again. But that was one moment when I sort of thought, oh, okay, the consciousness and the body, even though the consciousness is inhabiting this body, it's not dependent on it, And that was a lived experience that proved that to me. And I had another similar experience in a dhikr one time, and we were doing a hadra, not even a very...
I just want to give it explanation. So zikr
Yes.
is like the remembrance of God, and hadra is like a Sufi gathering.
A Sufi practice of breath, actually,
Yeah.
is when you say, hey, 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 hey. And as you can imagine, that is like a very rapid, like, intake of oxygen. And so, like, people, it's quite understandable that people might have like an altered state of consciousness out of that. But at the same time, more often than not, people can hold it. I mean, especially if it's something that you're accustomed to doing. You will feel really good, but you're not going to go wild. You're not going to fall apart and go crazy, right? I think this is one of the criticisms of Sufism and Sufi practices, that sometimes it's led to these kinds of excesses. But in practice, it's very unusual to see that, really, like somebody kind of like, falling into a hurl, into a state and like collapse. It happens occasionally. But by and large, it's just like, like laughing. When you laugh a lot, you go to see a stand-up comedian and you laugh all the time. Like, laughing is another form of bringing oxygen into your body, and you feel really good afterwards, right? Or going to the gym, you're also breathing more heavily. But obviously there's a different intention to that, because when you say, hey, you're talking about Allah being alive, like, and the breath is really the source of our, earthly life in the physical sense. So where was I going with this? Yeah, I was in a dhikr one time, and we were sitting. Normally with a hadra, we would be standing, and so that this breathing exercise kind of, I think, is more sort of all fully embodied. But we were sitting and doing like a very subtle, very soft, hey, hey, hey. And again, at that moment, I also noticed that I felt myself kind of floating up out of my body, and sort of had to consciously come back down again. And I think I was about 17 or 18 by that point. So I think by then I'd already sort of established within myself, this is my lived experience and I can't deny it. And people might scorn it, and people might deny it and tell me that this is rubbish, but this is my lived experience. And I can't really allow myself to be gaslit into denying my own experience.
Yeah, of course.
I did used to sometimes also, around about the same time, like maybe 14, 15, I don't know, I spent a lot of time pondering, like, what is consciousness as well? Like, who is this person? How am I looking around and noticing things? And how does that relate to God? And I came up with this kind of schema. I don't know how. I guess because people give you these words like soul and spirit, and I was puzzled by like how they fitted together. And I came up with this schema, which I sort of come back to from time to time and think, yeah, that's actually not so bad. Whereby the spirit was kind of like, it felt like the trace of the divine in almost like in my spinal cord. But it was very, very pure and very sort of unaffected by things, like earthly things. And it was completely connected to Allah, completely connected to the divine, because it's like the breath of Allah. but it's not like if you rest in the spirit all the time, you're disconnected from the human experience as well, like and you know, empathy. Like in this spirit might be very, very rooted in a sense of kind of benevolence and compassion, but doesn't really have much feeling to it. And then so I felt that the soul was this kind of intermediate space of, or intermediate, I guess, bandwidth or sort of area of consciousness where it is connected. It's like it's like you have your body, the flesh, which is of the earth, and you have the spirit, which is from the divine, and then you have this kind of intermediate, and now I can think of it as an isthmus. It's like a sort of intermediate realm where they meet and they kind of blend, and you're able to experience feeling and the expanse of that potential kind of territory of that feeling can be very vast as well.
Yeah.
And then from there, well, what is the heart? I guess that's another question. And, you know, we know from the Hadith Qudsi that Allah doesn't, that the world can't contain Allah, but the heart of a believing servant can contain Allah. So again, this is kind of like, is this a receptacle? I guess I don't really necessarily believe in having definitive answers to these questions, but I think they're really beautiful things to think about because they take the consciousness inside, take your awareness inside, and encourage you to just to notice what's happening within. Like we're so often focused on the outside, but again, it's like you need to rock back on your heels sometimes and bring it inside and kind of comb through all those layers, because for one thing, it's a whole dimension of our experience and our being that is worthy of being noticed. But for the other, it's also very, very it's like a recharge. If you're constantly sending your attention outwards, it's like you're expending energy all the time. And at a certain point you can get really burnt out and worn out and drained and exhausted, like mentally exhausted. And I've definitely found that I've found myself in that situation many a time. And so by pulling the attention inwards and just sitting with it and not expecting anything to happen, you know, it's like from the outside, if someone's just had a video camera on you, it doesn't look like you're doing anything. But on the inside, a lot of things can be happening. And you could be remembering things. You could be forgiving yourself for something that you've always beaten yourself up about. You can start observing your inner dialogue. You can your inner monologue and question it. You can start saying, actually, I don't want to be telling myself this all the time, or I'm just not going to listen to that voice anymore. You know, but without having that space where you intentionally do that, you can be running on very old systems, you know, like out of date systems. And that's when things start crashing.
Yeah, I really feel like your description is so evocative. Like I feel like I'm floating there with you in this ether, you know. It's really beautiful how you describe it. You're clearly a poet and writer with the way you speak even. And it's so interesting describing these experiences as such a young girl, having such powerful spiritual experiences. And I know that you are the daughter of converts in growing up in the UK. Please tell me what that was like, because for a lot of converts, most of the time they around your age, people usually convert on their own, but aren't raised by converts. So what was that like to be raised in your era? Yeah, especially when there's more isolation, less connectedness between Muslims around the world.
I think that's I think one of the main points that I would that has I think sorry, I'm it's hard to articulate in a way because I think the isolation and the alienation was very pronounced and had a very deep impact on me. But equally, I was very impacted by the things that my parents would talk about, and just, you know, conversation over dinner tables, and, you know, those kinds of people they had over, and the kinds of things you just hear in the background. And I think we were very present in that as well as children. You know, it wasn't like, oh, the children are going to the nursery. You know, it was like we were all part of the same thing. And we made trips as well. We went to Morocco and Meknès when I was very, very young. And I think we went to Fez, Tetuan, and I have very faint memories about that. I remember there being a frog in a squat toilet in the hole and in the floor. That was one of the main memories I have from that experience
Of Morocco.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I was about 5 at the time. So we went to Tunisia as well, and visited a Sufi sheikh there in Sfax. And, you know, these were very kind of like blurry memories, but I think things go in, you know, like learning about the brain now, it's extraordinary to know that like everything that you have ever seen or heard or learned, it's all stored in your brain. The difference is whether you can access it or not. And I think that these things do have an impact. And so there was a very strong, in some ways, quite a strong, I think, effort on the part of my parents to like, because I think if you're a Muslim growing up in the West, you have a double education. You have the education of how to be in the West, and you have the education that you're given from the system, the governmental system or the private system that you know, that you were educated in. And you go to university and you learn from those curriculums and those syllabuses. But then you have this parallel education about Muslim history, about ethics, about aqidah, about language, you know, scripture, hadith. It's like that's a whole education of its own. But if you're living in the West and growing up here, you have to juggle both. I mean, it's actually quite a stretch, which is a good thing. I mean, I think in the end, you get double the amount of information, and you're able to choose. You're able to kind of compare and contrast and juxtapose. That gives you a lot of flexibility in different situations. But it's also challenging. It is definitely challenging. Thinking now, like comparing now how I can be very connected and feel very connected to people who are Muslim or just curious, you know, in all different parts of the world. Like we're having this conversation now, and you're in Turkey and I'm in Spain, and it feels like we're in the same room. You know, subhanAllah, that's, I think, one of the extraordinary things about there is a kind of a spiritual dimension of technology in a funny sort of a way.
Definitely.
Or the potential for it, or just to prove that you don't have to be physically close to somebody to feel close to them, in an experiential sense or an emotional sense. What else did we do? We went on Umrah when I was about 16 as well. But yeah, as a very sort of general overview, I felt that the people that I really very much connected to were other children of converts, because they had a very, you know, they had that lived experience which was so closely paralleled in many regards. And in some ways, like Muslims who hadn't come from converts, who were born Muslims, sometimes there was not necessarily, I mean, that's on my part, I didn't have as much awareness of their culture and where they were coming from, again, because of that isolation. But that grew over time. I think what I'd like to speak a little bit to the experience of growing up in the 90s, which was quite particular. You know, it was like Friends era. That was like everything was, you know, I was the Phoebe, you know, and like everybody was kind of aesthetically and like in terms of your sense of humor and all these different things, like so much of our kind of coming of age was influenced by that sort of, not just Friends, but you know, that sort of very American derived
Beverly Hills 90210.
Oh my gosh, yes. You know, Backstreet Boys. That was the whole kind
Oh
of.
dear. I don't want to remember that.
Yeah, don't wipe it from your memory. You don't need to. It was very commercial. I think, you know, if you look at the sort of last, I mean, I don't want to say 100 years. I haven't been around very long either, but you know, my mum grew up in America. She remembers desegregation. She was only able to wear a skirt in her first year of university. Like it wasn't until her second university that girls were allowed to wear trousers. She remembers, you know, dancing with a black kid at her prom and her teacher coming up to her and saying, "Hey, if he ever touches you again, you just tell me." You know, like that was very present in her life. She remembers she went to anti-Vietnam protests, anti-Vietnam War protests. And you know, just like her sort of coming of age as well, like, and seeing the way that America has where America has gone. Like, I mean, I grew up in the UK, but as I have an American mother, and so that always sort of was one part of my, and I was actually an American citizen about 33 years longer or before I wasn't a British citizen because of various complications, paperwork. But so I was always quite aware of myself of being kind of half American. But also Britain was very much, deriving so much of the sort of popular culture from America, and very much kind of following in their wake. And I think, going back to now, I feel like we're coming full cycle. We're coming back to a sort of like a Vietnam War protest era and like a sort of civil rights era. I think possibly starting with the George Floyd protests, the protests of his killing by police. And so like, but from the 70s, like after the 70s, we had the 80s, which was like all just like greed and like, I don't know, not just greed, but I feel it was a very sort of capitalistic era, like looking at the politics and
the Reagan era,
the Reagan era, and it was Maggie Thatcher, and it was very much about like altering society for the benefit of the few, and everybody had to just be aspirational. Like you just had to scramble to try and scramble your way to the top. Otherwise you would be crushed. And then, the 90s was sort of like the product of that in a way. It was sort of, there was a bit of a hippie, grungy kind of side to it as well, but it was still quite commercialized. It was still very sort of Nirvana and I don't know, like, and hip hop, of course, started booming. I mean, hip hop's been around for a long time, but anyway, I'm sort of, I'm rambling all over the place here, but I feel like, we've now come to a place where we've seen decades of that, and we have several generations raised in a very, very, essentially a very materialistic society, in which the options are you study hard, you work really hard, you get your mortgage, you accumulate stuff, your worth is determined by the value of the clothes that you're wearing and the Rolex on your wrist or the phone that you have in your hand. And we have the product of that is a generation of people who are really actually kind of rejecting that in a way. They're still caught up in it too, but there's also a lot of rejection of it, because it's like, well, that's left us really depressed. That's left us feeling like absolute shit, and where is the meaning, and where is the rootedness? We're so far away from our roots. So there's a increasing interest in indigenous cultures and decolonization. What does that mean? These are words that kind of become buzzwords, which I think can be problematic as well. When something becomes a buzzword, it just becomes this kind of like fashionable thing. But at the same time, I think it's very interesting that looking at how protests against the Israel's onslaught on Gaza, for example. I mean, we've never seen protests like this around the world, certainly not for Palestine, but people are making those connections. And I think part of the reason for that, obviously a big part of the reason for that, is US militarism. US militarism is part of a culture of, several decades of so much attention being focused on how to make money. And that's become people's religion. And I actually had a really disturbing thought this morning. I don't know if I should share it, but
go ahead.
You know how like the sort of Enlightenment sort of values like to posit themselves as the civilized people against, savages who would practice human sacrifice, like these sort of the Aztecs and the Mayans who actually abandoned human sacrifice quite a long time before they were colonized anyway. And the Celts used to practice human sacrifice. But in a way, we're back there now because we're still in a religion of money in which human sacrifice is practiced. It's just that the people being sacrificed are on the other side of the world. And I find that a very disturbing thing. And I think many people find that very disturbing. And the more information we have about it, the more shocking it is. And it's sort of stimulating a lot of contemplation and, self-questioning and like, who do we want to be? And what kind of world do we want to have? But it really has to start with who we are, because if we won't accept that, that's gonna have an impact on, I guess, on everything.
Yeah. Thank you, Medina. It's interesting that you really positioned us interestingly in thinking about the decades in the past and how that affected you and your spirituality too, and we're a product of our environment, right? So could you take us on a kind of a brief journey from, it sounded like you had very deep spiritual experiences as a young woman, as an adolescent. Can you take us on a little journey? What was it like in your 20s, your 30s? How did your spiritual path go?
Evolve.
Yeah, evolve.
So I still felt quite intensely private about my religion and spirituality. I think through a lot of my, well, a lot of my youth, but especially like into my 20s at university, you know, I was a bit terrified of the Islamic society. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna chill, do my own thing
Mhm.
here, and also figure things out for myself. I mean, one thing I
So
didn't
did you
mention,
do you like distance yourself
yeah,
from Muslim community? Yeah.
until the last year I was at university, where I during Ramadan I was just, I'd had a couple of Ramadans where I just fasted every day by myself.
Mm,
Everything had been alone, and it had felt very depressing. It was winter as well,
mm,
which is supposedly an easy time to fast, but you know, Ramadan is not just about fasting. It's
yeah.
also about being together with people and
Mhm,
enjoying the beauty of it.
mhm,
And because I'd lacked that, I'd felt awful. And so finally, by then my last year, I kind of managed to reconnect with specifically during iftars, with other Muslims who were studying, and sort of realizing, oh, it's not just the ISOC, because the ISOC kind of represented the like the the very, like, actually they were a little bit on the fundamentalist side, I've got to
mhm,
say, like not wanting to pigeonhole anyone. But I was like, okay, this isn't my vibe. Not really keen on this.
mhm,
And that was why I'd sort of avoided them. I've always been very candid with people about being
mhm,
Muslim, but I've wanted to avoid being pigeonholed, I guess.
mhm,
And I wanted to just be able to say, look, I'm just gonna have to do this my own way.
mhm,
Not to like form my own religion or anything, or my own
mhm,
sect, but I have to I have to live with this in a way that feels authentic. It feels
mhm,
sustainable and doable. And I don't feel like I'm doing it to get the approval of the local imam,
mhm,
or the, you know, the matriarchs of the
mhm,
community. um I really have to do it in a way that is the most sincere possible, and I'd rather do it on my own rather than, you know,
yeah.
constantly being told you're not a proper Muslim unless you're doing it this way, or you're
Mhm,
not a proper Muslim unless you're doing it that way.
mhm,
um so there was a little bit of a turning point, I guess, although it was a flashpoint too. In my third year of university, I was doing a year abroad in Tanzania. I was
mm,
studying there, and Ramadan fell in
mm,
that time. And so people that I wasn't wearing hijab, and people were kind of just like, they accepted me as a Muslim, kind of.
mm,
That's always been another thread, you know, throughout my life. That's what, you know, I explored in the Invisible Muslim, is kind of, you travel as a Muslim, as a white Muslim, well, I was a child of converts, but some people will be very welcoming and think it's wonderful. Some people will be a little bit over the top in their, you know, sort of, there's a bit of a fetishization that goes on.
mhm,
And then there's other people who'll just be like, really? Not really sure about that. I'm
mhm,
going to test you. I'm going to keep you a little bit on the edge because I'm not really
mhm.
sure about this. Are you a spy? I mean, I've heard people even be told that, you know, they think they're spies.
Oh, for
So,
sure.
and I understand also people's reticence about that and fear. But anyway, so Ramadan came around, and the Muslims around me were really like, okay, you've got to be really practicing for Ramadan. Okay. We're not gonna like let you off the hook here because you're some fluffy, like, European hippie. So I was wearing hijab in that time, and you know, and fasting, and it was obviously quite easy to fast there. It's on the equator, so it's a short day. It's only
Mhm,
like, it's 12 hours. Um, Pretty much any time during the year, the times don't really change. And I just sort of suddenly realized, you know, some of the people that I'd gone with, who were from, you know, my friends from university, there was one who just couldn't look at me. She just
mm,
couldn't look at me at all. And you know, the other one who I was living with at the time, she kind of got quite into it. It's like, oh yeah, let's just try out different sort of hijab styles and stuff. But there was one who was really just like, just couldn't look at me at all. And I sort of, you know, it sunk in a little bit, like, okay, I can tell people that I'm Muslim, but they might not really believe me. If they see it in a really obvious,
mhm,
clear, visible way, and it's really in their face, you
mhm.
start to see some prejudices
Yeah.
that come up on, you know, how you get a visceral sense of their rejection as well. And that's always been something that I kind of struggled with, and I'm getting a bit better with it now. I don't really, I mean, yeah, I don't really choose to wear hijab in everyday ways, but also if I put a hijab on, I feel fine. I feel good about it. It's not like I don't like wearing hijab, but there is that noticeable kind of rejection that you can
Mhm,
get from people. And I did used to really struggle with that and find that very difficult. And lately I've been just working a lot on that rejection. Like, where is that coming from? And is there a way to heal that wound? I mean, that's a very deep childhood wound, I think, that sort of formed my whole personality, like the way that I operate in the world. But like to be able to live with that, and that's actually a Sufi practice as well. It's like to be able to live with rejection of society, like to be able to live with people saying horrible things about you because you've chosen a certain path that for you is right, but for some people they're going to think that that's wrong.
Yeah.
And to just be able to look through it and say, well, you know, people see the world through the lens of where they are, and if they're not on board with truth in the way that you believe that you are, it's going, you know, what you do is really going to trigger them, and they might respond in really, really vile ways. And, you know, to be able to get to a place inside yourself, this has been something that I've really given a lot of thought to and sort of inner work to over the last year or so, to be able to recognize that, you know, if you can come back to your awareness as spirit, for example, that spirit is inviolable. There's no harm that anyone or anything can do to it. And that's a great place to come to in those situations, because that's when it's not going to sit, it's not going to stick onto you and like lacerate your kind of your soul, and then you know go forward into life with these deep wounds and traumas. Obviously you can't be there forever, but as you know, you could say that that's like your truest self. It's inviolable. Nothing that anybody does can possibly harm it. And that's a very comforting position to take in really, really harsh situations. And what I've experienced is a fraction of what many others have experienced. But it is, I think, great learning to adopt. I don't know if I answered your question at all. I just
I think so. So how would you describe your current spiritual path? It sounds like you have a lot of things, working on. Maybe the healing process now seems really important to
Yeah.
you. How would you describe your healing path in parallel, or maybe it came later on?
I think intuitively I went towards certain activities that were healing, like writing, like music, like singing, zikr, obviously, prayer. Those are things that I think I intuitively felt, this is good for me. This is good for my soul. This is going to be healing. And so I went with that, and I haven't really had like a practice of like journaling every day, for example, but I know it's like there's a build up and there's a point where I'm like, okay, I have to sit down and write, otherwise I'm just going to lose my mind. And more recently, I started, after having some very nasty experiences with a few people kind of quite close to me, I started a course of meditation, but really it was meditative self-inquiry. And it was interesting, it kind of dovetailed quite nicely with that sort of teenage framework that I'd come up with, of, you know, here's your sort of self that is completely eternally connected to God. And here's your sort of little tiny human self, which is full of its wounds and it's egoic. And here's this space also in between where you can kind of tap into that resource from the divine. You can tap into the resources of, you know, infinite compassion and infinite patience and infinite kindness. But it's also strong because, you know, Allah is also al-Qahhar, is also like, Allah is also the destroyer, you know. But by and large, our experience is of benevolence and of kindness and generosity. So you can tap into that and sort of inhabit a part of yourself, which is like a sage. It's like the sort of fully actualized you. It's like the enlightened you. And from that perspective, approach this like hurt you, right? And just sit with it, maybe give it a hug, just give it some affirmation and give it some love and some kindness. And that alone is so tremendously powerful. I think you can do a lot in a conscious way. So whereas, you know, these other practices, they can be doing a lot of work of healing and you don't notice it's happening. You're not trawling through your childhood experiences. It's not verbalized, but it's happening. But then there is also a time, I think there is a time for doing it in a conscious way, when you sit down and say, right, I'm gonna see where this is stored in the body. And that's another part of the practice that I think Islam is naturally very embodying and very
Mm-hmm.
embodied. It's an embodied spirituality because you have a prayer which is physical. You put your head on
Mm-hmm.
the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's connected to the planets. It's connected
Mm-hmm.
to sunrise and sunset.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also commanded to observe nature, like read the book of Allah, read the creation, you know, and ponder it. So in a way, it's very embodied, and that's one of the things I love about it. But to sit and use the mind in a intentional way to bring awareness and bring it internally. I came up with a little acronym yesterday of like, I was doing a meditation session and I sort of thought, wow, there's a whole inner world of subtlety. I was like, that makes a nice, neat little acronym, a WEWOS.
A world of subtlety.
A whole inner world of subtlety. And I think that's, again, it comes back to that thing of like, you get so spent and so exhausted putting your attention out externally. Bringing it internally is like, it's the yin to the yang, and it's just that deep rest and that deep resource and reconnecting that, that's how you fill your cup. I
Yes.
think it is a phrase that gets thrown around a little bit, but I think that's a really beautiful and important way of doing it, and also bringing in questions. And so you're not just, oh, I'm just going to be really spiritual and I'm really
Mm-hmm.
above everything and
Mm-hmm.
spiritually bypass all this stuff.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity to have those questions and to use the questioning to kind of
Mm-hmm.
go a little bit deeper and
Mm-hmm.
untangle things a little bit further. And I think it's quite extraordinary what can be done in a conscious way as
Yeah.
well, you know.
Well, that's really important. Thank you for sharing the fact that yes, we need space and we need rest and we need to go inwards because we are constantly focused on the external world and we neglect the internal world. And if we keep on neglecting it, it explains why we're burnt out, why we're exhausted, why we can't function well.
Yeah.
So yeah, completely. And I think this brings us to the next question, which we talked about. That's very important to discuss, is the fact that you live in the countryside of Andalusia, El Andalus, and you're very interested in the spiritual ecology of El Andalus. Could you tell us more about that and even what it's like to live in a rural area? Personally, I've always been a city girl, so I am so curious about what it's like to live in the countryside, and it seems to have really inspired your entire way of seeing the world and your spirituality. So please tell us more.
Yes. Before that, I'll just mention that my computer battery is running a bit low, and my charging situation is a bit complicated. If I charge it, my microphone will not work. So I'm just going to go on as long as I can, and inshallah.
Okay. How long do you think you have? We'll edit this part out.
Might be like 10 minutes or so. So I
Okay,
think I'll just
lovely.
do a
That's
quick
about,
summary.
yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay, so
And you
I
can
think,
dim your camera, maybe your computer, so you have more
yeah,
time.
I put the sound, I
Okay.
put the light on my computer
Okay.
down.
Yeah.
I don't have any other apps running, so I think it
Mm,
might be okay. But yeah, it might cut off.
sure.
So I think this coincided with really becoming pregnant with my first child. And I think pregnancy is an extraordinary time because you're physically, there's so much happening on the inside. So like
Mm-hmm.
you can't help but think about what's going on inside.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I was never all that sort of rooted in the body until then. And that was a time when I really had to start going, okay, I'm gonna have to tackle my dissociation here
Mm-hmm.
and my tendency to float away into like
Mm-hmm.
abstract and intellectual sort of spheres. And especially like giving birth as well, that's like such a humongously physical act,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time it's the bringing into the world of a new human being, and that also naturally just blows your
Mm-hmm.
mind. And I
Yeah.
think it is something very profoundly spiritual as well about the connection between a baby and the mother. Like the womb is just,
Mm-hmm.
it's an extraordinary space of creativity. And from there, and obviously then having a small baby is very physical too, like the lack of sleep, and so you can kind of start hallucinating. But you're physically moving and doing a lot, so it was very good for me in that sense, because I think it helped me to re-embody a lot. And alhamdulillah, I was very blessed with 3 healthy pregnancies and home births. I had really amazing births. So I feel very, very lucky and very blessed to have been able to have that. I know not all women I'll give them that experience. And I was very supported. I had an independent midwife each time. Again, that's a privilege that I had, and that certainly impacted the birthing experience. And where I was living when I had my first child was out in the countryside. It wasn't a particularly inspiring countryside. I didn't like want to be out very much. I think as a kid, I grew up in the countryside, but you know, East Anglia, it rains a lot. It's drizzly. It's not even the wettest part of England, but it is still quite drizzly. It was like sugar beet fields. Okay, I was just like, whatever, I'm not interested in this at all. And then when my first child was 1, me and my then husband, we were like, what are we doing here? Let's just go somewhere else. It's like we wanted to build a house and, you know, build some space for a family. And it was too expensive in England. And my parents were living in Spain by that point. So I was born in Spain, but then we moved when I was 1. And that's why I grew up in the UK. But then my parents moved back. And we were looking at prices there, and it was like, oh, we can buy a piece of land, we could buy something to fix up for a fraction of the price, you know, really like a quarter or less of the price, and we'd get to be in a sunny environment. And of course, where my parents were living at the time, well, they still live here now, there's a Muslim community, there's a Sufi community here. So that was also a big attraction. And, you know, being a first-time mother with a baby, like I just wanted to be with my mom. I like wanted to have some family around and some support. So that prompted us to move back here. And I think this landscape was much more interesting to me. I felt very much more like, oh, okay, I can be here. I can be in the sun.
Oops. Okay.
So I think moving to this area, especially as I had been born here as well, I felt there was some connection to this landscape. And then also, I mean, before I learned very much about Al-Andalus and the history here, I mean, I had some awareness of it, of course. I knew that Granada, the Emirate of Granada, had been the last sort of area, really it was the last kind of bastion of Al-Andalus and of Muslim rule, in a political sense, not in a societal sense, because there were Muslims, there have been Muslims continuously ever since then, and actually quite a lot, but that's a whole other story. So, but just being here, I felt a lot more inclined to be in the out of doors. Like it was very drizzly. Also being in the mountains, there's a lot of difference. Like there's little rivers, and you know, you might find waterfalls. It's very beautiful. It is it's actually a national park. So it was a lot more you know, conducive to wanting to sit in nature and be there. But also, you know, olive trees. You'd see an olive tree and someone would say, this was planted 1,000 years ago. And you'd just be like, what? You know, that immediately connects you to a reality that was in this place, but rewinding 1,000 years. And those are trees that were planted by Muslims. And there were some that were planted before the Muslims were here. That's what's also quite kind of mind-blowing. But I think principally they were planted by Muslims because the Muslims of Al-Andalus were excellent agricultors. They developed a body, not just agricultures, but also botanists. And what I came to learn about later, and I'd had sort of intimations of it because people said, oh, the oranges were brought by the Muslims, the lemons were brought by the Muslims, the figs, the pomegranates, the saffron in the paella. Paella is an old Muslim dish. It's from baqiyya, it's from leftovers.
Really?
Yeah, rice was brought, cinnamon was brought, aniseed, basil, tons and tons of ingredients which are very quintessential of Spanish cuisine, especially in the south and in the east, were brought by Muslims. And so you kind of start thinking, oh, okay, so the Muslim influence was very tangible to the point where it's edible. You know, it's actually, you can build your body, but also, you know, it never really went away. Like it was incorporated, it was sort of absorbed and you know, subsumed into Andalusian culture. And there's still quite a lot. It varies. There's still a lot of prejudice against Arabs and against Moroccans, for example. Quite a lot. And that kind of keys into the fascist past as well of Franco. But from the Andalusian side of things, there's also, you know, Blas Infante, who was like the father of modern Andalusia. He wrote the Andalusian hymn, he designed the flag. He was an Arabist, and some people say he actually became Muslim as well. He was obsessed with Islamic art. He built his house in a sort of Moorish style. And so there is also a lot of pride in the Muslim past. And that's something that you don't find in England. You can't go to an English village and have people just sort of randomly talking about how they're, you know, they're proud of their Muslim past. It's just, you're not going to find it. Although there were Muslims for, you know, a long time ago visiting and living in England. So that also gave me a sense of, you know, history is alive. It's present. It's not just something that happened once upon a time somewhere else. It's still available. And also hearing, like, I met a guy who I thought he was Moroccan. And then he was married to a Moroccan woman. But then I talked to him and he said he was from Extremadura, which is another area of Spain, similar to where I am around Granada, very mountainous, where there were a lot of Muslim renegades who refused to be baptized. And actually, they were baptized. Then they would go into the mountains and perform unbaptisms in nature.
Really?
Yes. So they would go to rivers and springs and they would perform an unbaptism.
I've never heard of that. Amazing.
I know, it's extraordinary. But, you know, the Muslims who were, you know, forced to become Christian, they were given, they weren't allowed to use Arabic surnames. So they would take surnames like Romero, which means rosemary, del Pozo, of the well, de la Roca, del Monte, names that related them to nature. They pick plant names, they pick place names. And del Rio, you know, this is a kind of a known phenomenon. Why? Because they felt very, very connected to the earth. So they created, going back again to Andalusia times, a completely unique and unprecedented body of work, which were manuscripts about agriculture and botany. And in fact, in the medieval period, the people who knew the most about botany and who produced the most studies were from Al-Andalus, anywhere in the world. They pushed the study of botany ahead by a very long way in that period. And they were building on stuff, you know, from Dioscorides, from Galen, from the Greeks, from the Persians, from the Egyptians, you know, from the Yemenis. A lot of that was to do with how to use water. So they would dig water channels, water mines. You can still visit places that are called water mines, and that's technology that comes from Iran, actually, and from Yemen. And they developed a network of acequias, which comes from the Arabic asaqiya, the irrigation canals. I'm speaking now. Canales,
Canals
yeah.
in American English. I don't know about British.
Channels, canals, you know what I mean.
Canal,
and so, like the Albaycin of Granada, for example, all the water of the town, and they had dozens or even hundreds of hammams, came from, you know, snowmelt and rivers high up in the mountains, and they were gravity fed. And you still see some of them, they're still running. The Alhambra, for example, has like water. Yeah, these are like they run for like many, many miles. There were even people from Granada called neveros, well, now in the modern era they were called neveros, which means the ice gatherers, I suppose, or the snow people. And they would go up into the mountains and cut slabs of ice, and bring it down into the city and sell it. People would use it in their drinks. That was when it was still snowy on the mountain in the summer, which is not the case now because of climate change. But that also goes back to the Islamic period. There were, I think I read, there were 800 gardens in the vicinity of the Alhambra alone. I mean, Granada was a very green city. It had a lot of small private gardens, a lot of huertos, allotments. So that's a very big history that I'm still researching, you know, the contrast between the sort of massive and extractive monocultures of the Roman Empire, which controlled a very large part of Spain, which they called Hispania Baetica. And it was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. It produced olive oil here, and I think wheat and a few other things, which were they were actually given to people in the Roman Empire. They all came from Spain. And even the pots, the amphora that the olive oil was transported, all came from Spain. So what's it called? There's a mountain, a hill in Rome that's entirely built out of these olive oil amphora shards. So where was I going with this?
So about your connection to the land and your inspiration from what Andalusians, the Muslim Andalusians left behind and how it's influenced you.
Yeah, and also the even though when you come to Spain as a tourist and you're looking at Al-Andalus, the temptation is, or the general pattern is, you go to see the centers of glorious, government. You go to see the palaces, you go to see the Mezquita, you go to see the Alhambra, and they're beautiful and they're amazing places. I would really recommend everyone goes to them. But often we see medieval history through the lens of the rulers,
Yeah.
the kings, and sometimes the queens, the princes, the governors, and who 9 times out of 10 were corrupt, greedy, and power hungry. They would sometimes, murder members of their own families to, usurp the throne. This happened in Europe, in Northern Europe, in Christian Europe. It happened also in Al-Andalus. And so if you if you want to connect with Al-Andalus and you try going down that road, you get stuck because at a certain point you go, this is horrible and I'm not really keen on this. It's not something to feel proud of. I'm not going to be like, oh, look at our wonderful Muslim ancestors. But if you go to the land and you start looking at the ways in which people related to the land, and the documentation around that is not quite so accessible. Like there aren't so many history books written about. I mean, I'm writing one at the moment actually, but about like the way that the rural population, because the majority was related to the land. That kind of information isn't so easily available to a tourist or to a casual reader. But it gives you a much better appreciation, to my mind, of how people actually lived. What their lives were really like, how they ate, how they built their houses, how they washed their clothes, like the everyday stuff, the poetry they wrote, the songs that they wrote. Very often the poetry revolved around it involved metaphors of plants. They described women as plants. So they described, men as plants also. There's a very famous poem by Ibn Khafaja, who was a sort of premier nature poet of Al-Andalus. He wrote this poem called The Mountain, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. And he describes a sort of a world-weary pilgrim or traveler. And he walks up. It's kind of typical Qasida ode, right? That's sort of the travel, going out on the journey, almost like the hero's quest. And he comes to a mountain and he hears the mountain speaking. And basically most of the poem is the mountain speaking about all the things that it's seen and describing it as a like a person, like the coloring of the plants, like the hair on his beard and stuff. And like the turban, the white turban of snow on its head. So I personally believe, after having looked at this a lot, that there was a strong identification with the land that the average Andalusi person had. Maybe not the scholar who was, but even the scholars, they weren't just living in an ivory tower. They had, palace gardens where they did experiments. They got their hands dirty. There was a very close relationship between the gardeners, like the sort of palace court gardeners, and the scholars of the court, and they exchange information a lot. So in a way that there's a strong message of embodiment there as well. It's like, this knowledge has to be practical, it has to be connected. And even people who wrote about philosophy and spirituality and love and things like that, they would often use metaphors from plants. They would describe, the tree of knowledge and like all the different parts of it, the roots and the branches and the tree of love, the birds living in it. And they would go into so much detail because nature was physically much more present to them. They were more present to it. There wasn't a physical separation as you would find in the typical modern or contemporary urban environment, where if you have some plant pots on your window, that might be the closest you get, and that can still be enough to make you connected, especially if they're edible plants. But
so tell me, Medina, how did this change your connection to the land then, knowing so much about the history of not just the elite, but the local Muslims who lived there hundreds of years before? How did this change your experience?
It gave me an appreciation for awareness of the I don't know if it's very radical to say the sentience of the natural world. I don't think it's actually that radical because we have a lot of Quranic passages that say that everything in the heavens and the earth is glorifying Allah, but you don't understand its glorification. So, and even of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, hearing mountains and pebbles glorifying. And, you know, if a mountain can be glorifying, then surely a plant can be glorifying, surely an animal can be glorifying, you know, because they're that much closer to what we're like. And in fact, the Quran also says, we caused you to grow from the earth like plants. Like the Quran itself is relating human beings to plants. And so it's given me a lot more motivation to spend time sitting with plants and like meditate with plants and allow the plants being to interact with your inner world. And it sort of sounds crazy. It sounds very kind of woo-woo, but like if you do it, you often find you almost have a kind of a conversation. You get a sense for that plant in a different way. That doesn't mean to say that you will necessarily know what it's useful for, although there is a theory that that's how people actually learned what plants were for.
How do you meditate with a plant? Can you explain the process for those of us who live in cities who have less close a relationship with plants?
Sure, and you can do this in a city as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot more distractions in a city. That's one thing I'll say, but you can, as long as you have a plant, a living plant, you can sit with the plant, and it's really just a matter of patience and not rushing and not expecting anything. But actually, Goethe, the German poet, who was also a naturalist, he described a process, like a system for meditating with a plant and getting to know this plant, which I'll share because it's quite an easy pattern to follow. The first one is you go from, you have a separate place where you write, and you have another place where you go to be with the plant. So you sit with the plant just for a short while, just observe it. Then you go away and you write about it and you draw it, just quickly, quick sketch. Then you go back and you sit with it for longer. And you realize that actually there's a lot more to it than first meets the eye. You look at the texture of the leaves, the edges, the underside, the veins on the leaves. You look at the bark, you look at the way that it bifurcates, you know, the way that the branches come out. There's actually a different kind of numerical pattern for different plants. From the mint family, for example, it's there's two that come out and then another two that come out. It's got like a square stem. This is one of the ways that you actually identify plants. You look at the flowers, you look at the fruit if they have fruits and the seeds, you look at the young plant and the old plant. You spend a really long time really observing. Then you go away and you do another drawing and another set of notes, which is always very surprising how different it is from the first one. It tells a lot more things about it. And also things about like what kind of earth does it grow in? Does it need a lot of water? Is it growing in a dry place? Is it growing in a windy place? How are the elements impacting it? Things like that. And then you imagine yourself as the plant. You just sit in a meditative state, excuse me, and you imagine yourself kind of doing the dance of the plant, as if you could watch a sort of time lapse of a plant growing. You see it very young, you see it growing, getting bigger, and unfurling its leaves and its branches, and until it becomes like a mature plant. And I'll tell you what the experience I had with one particular plant, which was a this is going to make me sound really crazy, but you know, I think people have already got that. It was a plant called Viper's bugloss, which I'd actually read about in a book already, and I knew that it was used traditionally as a cure for viper's bite. So I was doing this with a group and we'd gone to look at it. We'd come back and had done our first preliminary sketch. Then we went back and looked at it again for longer. After about 5 or 10 minutes, and we were in silence, we noticed a snake that was lying among the plants. There was a snake, a black snake. I don't know if it was a viper, but it could have been a víbora because they are native to this area. And it's funny because the plant was growing in the exact same location that the snake liked to be, in this dry, sunny kind of cliff. And the snake was basking in the sun in this location. So that was already one thing that was like, wow, okay, that's kind of cool. That a plant that cures a viper's bite should have that kind of relationship with that plant. And then as we sat in the meditation, this is without touching it, we haven't ingested anything of it. We haven't made a tea or anything. I started sweating. I got very uncomfortable. I felt very unpleasant. And the images that I was getting were a bit like disconcerting, but in a kind of it was making me sweat and making my heart race. And then later when I went back to the book that I'd previously read about it, and you're meant to do this with a book that you don't know, a plant you don't know anything about. I went back to the book I'd previously read about it in, and it said it's a sudorific. It's a plant that if you take it as a tea, it makes you sweat.
Wow.
It raises your heartbeat, and it's something that, like, if you're having a cold or a flu, and you can actually have it as a tea or as a tincture to sweat out the illness. So that just made me think, okay, there's something going on
We're
here.
channeling the plant, Medina Tenour.
Not
Wow.
even touching it, but just listening to it. It's really just about listening.
That's really
And
powerful.
I want to circle back to the Andalusia thing for a minute, because I don't want to take too much more of your time, but there were certain contemplatives or mystics of the Andalusia period in Spain, in particularly in Cordoba, Seville, all over, also Almeria, Granada. But there's some of the earlier ones, Ibn Masarra and then Ibn Barrajan, they actually had it as their practice to go and take their students and sit in nature and just meditate and contemplate. That was a big part of their practice. And they also said that plants are like the lowest rung of the ladder towards the throne, the arsh of God. So contemplating plants was a very big part of what they did. And they talked about God. They're not the only people. Also, many other Sufis have talked about this. These guys didn't describe themselves as Sufis. They call themselves musta'abidin, like people who do crossing, who cross from the alam to the Hreib. But from, you know, the material world to the hidden world or the spiritual world. They sorry, I keep forgetting my train of thought. Oh, sorry, just give me a second.
No worries.
Oh gosh.
Take a breath.
Oh, that was what it was. Okay, so they described the natural world, the created world or creation, as a book of God. And they said we are reading the book of God. So they said, don't just read the Quran, read also this book. And that's what the Quran tells you to do. It says, contemplate, look at the stars, look at the water, look at the bodies of water, look at the rain and how it revives the apparently dead earth. And what occurs to me is that the Quran is principally an oral scripture. It's one that's just meant to be recited and heard and listened to. So to read the creation as a book of God, the reading that's being done is actually listening.
Yeah.
Right? Because yes, they did have documents. Yes, they had written Sahif, they had them written out. And even after they were burned by the Inquisition, they could write them out again. But principally, they were known as things that were memorized and that you would recite and you would listen to. So it makes sense to me that one possible pathway within all the many pathways of spirituality would be to listen to creation and just spending that time just being receptive, being quiet. There's no rush. You're not forcing anything. You're not pushing. You're not trying to get anything out of anything, but simply being quiet and listening. And that to me is really, is it muraqaba, you would call it? Like it's
Self-observation,
observation and contemplation and just sitting and allowing yourself to be aware.
Tadabbur of nature, yeah.
Exactly. So in a
That's
funny way, I
beautiful.
feel like I feel like you can come full circle with that and repeat that practice quite simply.
Well, thank you for sharing. I feel inspired. I live near a park, and tomorrow when I go on my walk, I'm definitely going to try that. And I hope listeners, that if they try this, they'll share how it went with them. You know, as I think we don't spend enough time contemplating the amazing beauty we have and the miracle that is nature, really. And you're right, see nature as a sign of the divine, really. So
There you go, like
beautiful.
the verse and the sign are there.
Exactly. Same meaning. Ayah means verse and it means sign. And so definitely nature is one of the many signs we have.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, I'd love to ask you, do you have any pearls of wisdom you'd like to share with people that from your life lived, from learned experiences?
Ooh, pearls of wisdom that I I don't know if I have any on hand that I can bring out of my own wording. I have found that there are certain sort of aphorisms or poems or, you know, those sorts of lines that have really helped me. One of those that I come back to quite often, by Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari, who actually his teacher was from Murcia. He was from Spain. He says states of need are like gift-laden carpets, or in some translations actually says they are gift-laden carpets. And it's one of those things that, you know, the conscious mind or the rational mind really can't grapple with, can't accept that at all. It's like, I'm struggling, I'm in lack, I'm in difficulty. Like, how is this good for me? How is it ever going to give? You're saying this is bringing a gift. Where's the gift? I don't see the gift. And I think this is really the essence of this decision to consciously turn away from a materialist way of life or mindset, and again cast the awareness inside and see what happens there. Because the gift is not, it's not like a gift wrap thing that arrives from Amazon. It's quite the opposite. And I think reassessing what our ideas of gifts are is a very important part of that, and understanding, you know, well, the understanding itself can be a gift. It is a gift, and it's a huge gift to be given understanding and to or to develop it. But it doesn't come easily. It's never going to just arrive like magically, you know. I think we have this sort of Hollywoodized myth of the sort of the, I don't know, this person who is just kind of like automatically, just by their nature, they've got it all figured out and they're this sort of wonderful heroic person. I don't think it works like that. I think you gain that gift of understanding, a duras penas, as they say in Spanish, like through hard pain, you know. And to be able to get to a place, again, you need that space and you need that ability to contemplate, and you need support in that as well. It's very hard to do that alone. To get to that place where you're able to go, wow, I've been stretched by that experience. It was so painful and I was desperate and I didn't know what was going to happen. I thought the whole world was falling apart. But now that I've got that distance from it, I've been stretched by it, and I'm not going to go back to the narrowness that I was before. I'm now something more capable, you know. I'm swimmable. I'm more sort of, you know, like a sea rather than like a pond. But yeah, there's and also to take that earth comparison a little bit further, one image that I come back to as well when I feel like life is pounding me is, you know, again, to think of ourselves as an isthmus, that the earth is vast. It's described as vast as well, again, in the Quran, that our bodies are made of earth. And if you think of yourself as earth, it's nice to do this as a meditation with the breath as well. I'm sure you do this already, with the in breath and the out breath being like the surging and the ebbing of water on a shoreline. And just to sit with that image for a period of time until it really sinks in that, like, actually, I'm big. Like, I can compare myself to the earth. I can live, you know, I can think of myself as the earth, and the earth is huge and it's so capable, and so many dramatic things happen on the earth. You know, a storm might, you know, crash against me, but I'm huge as well. And at the same time, this earthenness of my body has been infused with life and spirit. And this comes from Allah, from the divine. And this means that I'm never out of connection with, I'm never completely disconnected from that source of infinite patience and wisdom and light and guidance and benevolence. That's there as well. It's just melting together. I'm the kind of melting point between those two things. And that has been a great source of comfort to me as well in dealing with some very difficult times too.
Well, brilliant, Medina Tenour. This has been a absolutely inspiring and eye-opening, heart-opening conversation. I'm really grateful to have this with you. Could you tell us, for listeners, how can they find you online? If they want to get in touch with you.
The probably the easiest, I hate to give Meta any more airtime than they need, than they already have, but probably the simplest way to see what I'm up to and see some of my like past projects and also connect with me is through Instagram, which is Medina
Okay.
MENAT, you know you are. I have a website as well, but I don't really keep it very updated, but it's like a, you know, it's a background thing. And I have a
Yeah.
Substack as well, medinatenourwhiteman.substack.com. And that's something that I'm developing a little bit more because I'd like to do, I love long form writing,
Yeah.
essentially.
Great. And I will put the links in the show notes for people to find it there more easily. Thank you so much again. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you today, Medina Tenour.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much for letting me ramble.